Hi, Grandma here, and we are reading Dave at Night, the last chapter, 38. Mrs. Packer, Irma Lee, Sally, and Dave are headed back to the HHB. The lobby was empty. "Where do we go, boy chick?" I pointed to Mr. Doom's office. The door was shut, as usual. We walked toward it. Mrs. Packer's heels clacked on the tiles and echoed off the walls. Sally knocked, and Mr. Doom rumbled that we should come in. I got ready to run. Sally put his arm around my shoulder. There he was, Mr. Doom, huge as ever, mean as ever. He looked up and saw me. His left hand went up to hold his glasses in place. He smiled a fake smile. "Oh, Dave, we've been so worried about you." He stood. "Thank you for bringing Dave home," he told Sally. "Excuse me for a moment." He went to the phone on the wall and told the operator to call the police station. He was going to have me arrested. I tried to get away, but Sally held me tight. Mr. Doom said into the telephone, "Please tell Officer Kelly that our boy came home. He's with me right now, safe and sound." He hung up, came around the desk to shake Sally's hand. "Mazel tov," the parrot squawked. Mr. Doom backed up a step. "Beautiful bird. I love birds. You are Dave's." He paused, waiting for Sally to answer. "His grandpa." "And these," he nodded to Mrs. Packer and Irma Lee, "are your maids?" Now, why do you think he thought that Mrs. Packer and Irma Lee were maids? I am sure they were dressed very well. I think because back in those days, people didn't expect a black woman to be wealthy. So, anyway, how do you think Mrs. Packer's going to react to that? Him thinking that she's a maid. Well, we'll find out. How could Mrs. Packer scare him if he thought she was a maid? Irma Lee started giggling. Mrs. Packer looked like she was trying not to laugh. I didn't see what was funny. Mr. Doom continued, "I'm surprised you left Dave with us if I'm not a rich man," Sally said. Mr. Doom frowned, trying to figure it out. Then he gave up the riddle. "Dave, why did you run away?" I didn't answer. "Take off your coat, son." He reached for Papa's carving. "I'll hold this." I hugged the carving tight against my chest. He wasn't getting it. "Goslin, hold up neck," Bandit squawked. Bandit has figured it out. Mr. Doom shrugged. "I just don't want you to get overheated, Mr. Karros. Gruber, Solomon Gruber, and my boss here is Mrs. Odelia Packer." Odelia Packer? The Odelia Packer? Mr. Doom rushed at her. "Madam, I'm so sorry. I didn't recognize you." He straightened his suit jacket. "I'm honored to have you as a guest. Wait till I tell Mrs. Bloom. She reads to me about your salons. Did Baron Rothschild?" He held out his hand, which Mrs. Packer didn't take. "Mr. Gruber has told me shocking things about the institution you run here," Mrs. Packer said. "If something happened to me and my baby, my daughter, had to live in a place, God forbid something should, I would be spinning in my grave, spinning in edible food. The poor boys are freezing to death, and they're precious." She reached for Papa's carving. I let her have it. "Keepsakes are taken from them. Mr. Gruber would care for his grandson himself, but his health is too uncertain." Was this part true? I thought of how out of breath he got from climbing stairs and how slowly he always walked. I looked at him, but I couldn't tell. He was too busy being a Ganav, nodding seriously at everything Mrs. Packer said. "Madam, I deeply Mr. Gruber handles my charitable work." She turned to Sally. "I believe a board of directors oversees," Sally said. I saw Norman Rosen yesterday, just a few hours before Davila came, dripping. Sir, I never intended, if I had only known. Beads of sweat were gathering on Mr. Doom's forehead. Mr. Gruber can speak to Mr. Rosen tomorrow and tell him what happened. Oh, no, madam, he can't. He mustn't. The boy will be treated. Dave, he smiled as if he was begging. I meant no harm. I thought you stole my papa's carving and called him a bum. It felt grand to tell him off. You're the bum. You're the thief. You're the pescood. Enough, boy chick. Mr. Bloom gets the idea. I'm thinking that Norman Rosen is an important man on the board and possibly hired Mr. Bloom. Anyway, let's move on. Dave, will you accept my sincerest apologies? Oy vey, the parrot squawked. Gewalt! There was nothing sincere about him. Just stay away from my things and leave us 11s alone. Mrs. Packer waved her hand. Mr. Gruber and I know how difficult it is to run a large institution. Never enough money, never enough help. Mr. Newton nodded as she spoke. Never enough money, he echoed. He stood up. Madam, if you would interest yourself in our mission to bring up these children. Mr. Gruber, since Dave was here, I didn't feel right about suggesting a donation, but I think they could use a new furnace. For a second, Mrs. Packer looked blank. Then she chuckled. A new furnace. Sally was gonifing her too to get us a furnace. She was trying not to laugh. We'll look into it. Perhaps we can discuss it further when we come back to visit. Delighted, madam, delighted. Any time. When are visiting days, Dave? I told her and she promised to come. We left Mr. Doom's office then, and they all, including Mr. Doom, walked with me to Mr. Cluck's classroom. I didn't like walking anywhere near him. I had told him off and it felt good, but I wish Sally and Mrs. Packer would stay a little longer, like a few years longer. I wish Mr. Doom had signed an oath swearing he wouldn't touch me again. When we reached the classroom, we stood outside, shook hands with Mr. Doom. I expected him to squeeze my hand extra hard to show me what to expect later, but he didn't. It was like shaking hands with a dead fish. When I shook Mrs. Packer's hand, she said, when we come next Sunday, Dave, I'll expect a full report. If anything is wrong, your grandfather and I want to hear about it. Nothing will be wrong, madam, I guarantee it. I promised to tell her and thanked her for bringing me back. Then I turned to Sally. Is your health really poor, Grandpa? I'm not getting any younger, boy chick, he said, but I'm sound as a bell. Don't I look like a bell? I grinned and shook my head. Don't worry, I'll live to dance at your first art show and you can show me your drawings on visiting day. I shook Irma Lee's hand too. Goodbye, see you. I couldn't think of anything else, even though I hadn't said nearly enough. She whispered in my ear, we're having another party in 2 weeks. You'll come if you're my friend, Dave Caros. I grinned. Then they laughed, and I went inside to join my buddies. After they'd gone, I was jumpy all day. I knew Mr. Doom would want to beat me more than ever. He'd be sure to hate me for scaring him with Sally and Mrs. Packer. But he didn't touch me. Not that day, or the next, or the one after that. On Sunday visiting day, Sally and Irma Lee and her mama came. Mr. Doom pounced on Mrs. Packer in the lobby, and she had to listen to him for almost a half an hour. But then we went upstairs so Irma Lee could meet the 11s. At first, everybody was shy, including me. But then I thought of going out in the courtyard for a game of tag. Irma Lee was in heaven, and she was as fast as the best of us, and I was proud to show her off to my buddies. Mrs. Packer didn't buy us a new furnace, but at the beginning of January, she sent the HHB 40 quilts, exclusively for the 11s. After a while, when I was convinced that Mr. Doom wouldn't touch me, I began to practice my gonifing on him. I'd go right up to him and say, Mrs. Packer asked me to tell you hello. And then if I was with another 11, I'd introduce him. I'd say, "This is Mike," or "This is Eli." And I'd add, "He's my special buddy. So I hope you take good care of him, Mr. Bloom, sir." And Mr. Doom would shake my buddy's hand and my hand and tell me to send his regards to Mrs. Packer. So we were safe, all of us 11s. Nobody else was, though, until the nice nurse got fed up and went to the HHB Board of Directors about a month after I ran away. They investigated and fired Mr. Doom. We got a new superintendent, Mr. Drescher. The food wasn't any tastier, and we were still cold, but at least he didn't beat anybody. About 3 months after Mr. Doom left, Eli got a letter from Alfie. He'd learned how to milk a cow. "The first time I tried it," he wrote, "the cow stepped on my toe and I saw stars. But now I'm good at it. They make me drink so much milk here I can't look a glass of milk in the eye anymore." He said he had gained 5 pounds and the doctor said he was holding his own, even though he was still coughing. We didn't know what to think about that. Some of us thought it sounded bad. Some thought it sounded good. Harvey said it was Alfie's death sentence for sure. But anyway, Eli wrote back to him. We all added a few lines. I put in a drawing of Mr. Cluck to make him laugh. I took the special art lessons from Mr. Hillinger. I liked them very much. Very, very much. I did more gesture drawings and used watercolors and oil paints and even sculpture. About 6 months after the first special lesson, I did a drawing of Irma Lee that I wasn't too ashamed of. Mrs. Packer called it Baby Girl's Portrait, and she put it in a golden frame and hung it in their dining room. Mrs. Packer and Irma Lee didn't come every Sunday, but Solly never missed a visiting day. Plus, I met him often in the middle of the night at the Tree of Hope. He said I was the best groaner in Harlem. Tell for you your fortune? Okay, that's the end of the book, but there is an afterword, and I'm going to read the afterword also. And this is by the author, and she says, "My father grew up in the Hebrew Orphan Asylum, which was known as the HOA to the kids who lived there. It was a real orphanage located in the same place as the HHB, which I invented. My father's name when he was born was David Carasso, although he changed Carasso to Carson when he was old enough so he would be a real American. His mother died from childbirth complications when he was a few months old. His father, Abraham Carasso, died of gangrene after a cut he'd gotten in his carpentry work became infected. Abraham truly did build a cabinet with secret compartments for the Sultan of Turkey, and he truly did receive a medal, or so the family lore has it. After Abraham died, my father, his older brother Sam, and his younger brother Leo were placed in the HOA. My father's sisters and his older brother Sidney went to live with relatives. My father was much younger than 11 when he arrived at HOA, and although I don't know exactly how young he was, some children liked the HOA, but my father hated it. Many years later, he would tell my sister and me almost nothing about it, even though we were dying to know about the exciting childhood of our safe, respectable daddy. One of the few tales he did tell was sneaking out of the orphanage to buy candy. He had a thriving candy business in the HOA till he got caught and had to declare bankruptcy. After he left the home, my father had nothing more to do with the place until he and my mother retired. One day, a man recognized him on the street and turned out to be one of his HOA pals. After that, my father joined the HOA Alumni Association and was a member until he died in 1986. There are many differences between the fictional HHB and the real HOA. An important one is the HOA took in boys and girls. Another big difference is that relatives couldn't bring children directly to the HOA. The children had to be placed there through a legal process. As far as I know, the superintendents at the HOA were not monsters like Mr. Doom, but discipline was strict and punishments were severe. There's a wonderful book about the HOA called The Luckiest Orphans by Hyman Bogan, published by the University of Illinois Press. The HOA closed its door in 1941. Its most famous alumnus is the newspaper columnist Art Buchwald, and he's a very fine writer. Grandpa and I remember him very, very well. Although all the characters in David Knight are completely fictional, parties or salons were held during the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s and 30s that were attended by leading figures in the arts, both black and white. Alelia Walker, who inherited the hair straightening products fortune of her mother, Madam C.J. Walker, was a prominent hostess of the day. And I believe she was the first black millionaire, maybe the first female millionaire. The Crown Prince of Sweden did try to attend one of her parties and was unable to get in. Noah's Ark, the painting by Aaron Douglas that Dave admires during Irma Lee's party, was actually painted in 1927. Two excellent books about Harlem are When Harlem Was in Vogue by David Levering Lewis, published by Knopf, and This Was Harlem by Jervis Anderson, published by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. You Must Remember This by Jeff Kisseldorf, published by Schocken Books, is a delightful history of Manhattan from the 1890s to World War II. Like Dave, I know only a few Yiddish words and phrases, so Sally's Yiddish came from The Joys of Yiddish by Leo Roston, which is published by Pocket Books and which has many jokes along with the definitions. And I can say, I think I have read portions of that book, and it is very funny. Okay, that's the end. See you next time. Bye-bye.